David, great to talk to you. I know you're in Denver, but before we talk about last night's debate, I understand you had a surprise visitor at your CPAC Colorado conference today.
We sure did. 5 of Mitt Romney's sons showed up, and they said, well, we actually brought another family member, and it was Mitt himself, who had, of course, was in Colorado because of the debate last night. And the crowd went wild, of course.
Bet.
And he delivered a good speech. It was interesting because he didn't spike the football. He didn't act like you might expect someone to act. He handled it just right.
Yeah. And I think we saw that last night. I mean, everybody's talking about how there was no knockout punch. But you got a flood of reaction today from both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, who say, hey, you know what? He did what he had to do. It was a big win, and he needed this win.
Well, he did more than what he had to do. He did what he had to do in the sense that, most Americans are not like you and me. They're not obsessed with all of this sort of thing. They don't follow it on a minute-by-minute basis. They haven't seen the Republican debates where Romney performed pretty well. They haven't seen much except a barrage of negative ads trying to define him, trying to create a caricature, and a media that fawns on the president. So this was the first time that maybe of the 60 million people that tuned in, this was the first time that maybe 35 or 40 million of them really had a chance to see the candidates together up close and had a chance for the first time to see Romney without going through a media or opposition campaign filter. And he impressed them, as all the instant polls show and as all the commentary demonstrates. And what that does, aside from everything else, is it makes it very difficult for the Obama campaign to continue to run against a straw man caricature of him, because now the very people that they're trying to influence have seen him before the cameras, beside the president, and know that he can not only hold his own, but that he's knowledgeable, he's human, and he's not arrogant, and he's not all of the things that the Obama campaign has been claiming. So they've got to be back today thinking about how they reset their campaign strategy as they face the next debate.
Yeah, and as you point out, too, we also saw, I think the American people saw Obama for the first time without a prompter and without the media. They're putting a spin on it for him.
Right, to be somewhat fair to him, and I hate to do that, but incumbent presidents often have a real problem with the first debate. And the reason they have that problem is that, think about this, for 4 years, and in Obama's case it's been worse because of the fawning media, but for 4 years, nobody has said anything except, Mr. President, you're great. Mr. President, your ideas are wonderful. Mr. President, nobody can hold a candle to you. And so all of a sudden he finds himself on the stage with somebody who he's convinced shouldn't even be on the stage with him, and that guy whips him. Now, he's going to come back. He's going to go back with his advisors, and they're all trying to, as you notice, Chris Matthews and others are saying which advisor was wrong, why wasn't he briefed differently, why didn't he have different materials, and Obama himself is probably trying to blame it on Bush because he blames everything else on Bush. But the fact is he is going to come back more aggressively in the next debate, which will be a foreign policy debate, and is not a particularly good place for him to do that. But he is going to come back. The problem is that what I said before has already happened. In other words, when he comes back, he can be stronger, but he can't pick up all of what he's lost as a result of last night, because that's been lost, and because people now have a different image of Mitt Romney that's not going to go away and is not going to be simply wiped out by a better Obama performance in a later debate. So he comes out a net loser. In 2008, when he debated John McCain and won that debate, not by as great a margin as this one was won by Romney last night, Obama went up in the polls 3 or 4 points. I would expect that Romney would go up 3, 4, maybe 5 points in the polls as a result of this debate and then drop back a couple. But what he's done is change the narrative on the one hand, and at the same time made this a real contest in places that the Democrats thought they were beginning to get some traction. So this has really changed the nature of the race. And the other thing I'd say, because as you mentioned, I'm here at CPAC, this is a part of the conservative base that a Republican candidate has to rely on. And prior to last night, Mitt Romney had their heads, if you know what I mean. They knew he was a nominee. They knew he was saying acceptable things. They knew they had to work to get rid of Obama. They don't like Paul. They love Paul Ryan. Don't like Joe Biden. There's all these things, but it was nonetheless something that they were doing out of a duty and an obligation, and because of a dislike of Obama. Last night's performance won their hearts, and as a result, when he showed up today, he blew the top off the place. And I suspect that all around the country, the Republican base is getting much more activated than it was 24 hours ago. In fact, I've seen a couple of messages that that just, hundreds of thousands of people are sending in contributions via email and the rest that have been held back until now. But now they know they've got a candidate that's worth backing.
And you're seeing it there, a renewed energy.
That's exactly right. And that's different from what I was talking about in terms of the impact on the voters that see him for the first time. But it's just as important, because it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to go out and vote for this guy. It's another thing to say, I'm going to get up early and I'm going to drag my neighbor and all my relatives out and get them to vote. That's a huge difference.
And, David, too, don't you think we saw the Obama that we saw in the special report by Univision? He was being challenged and he didn't know what to do. He was very uncomfortable. He kept putting his head down. It's the same guy we saw last night.
No, that's exactly right, Jenny. First of all, this is a president and a politician who is very good at set-piece speeches. He is very bad when he gets off message or when he has to deal with facts. You saw it last night where he didn't know some of the details of his own proposals and programs in the Univision debate, and he also falls back, of course, on blaming everything on George W. Bush. In the Univision interview, when he was asked about Fast and Furious, he said, well, of course, that was something that George Bush did, and then as soon as we found out about it, we stopped it, which was a lie. But it was probably as little as he knows about it, and as little as he thinks about things. It's his natural default defense for anything that happened that was bad. That one was bad enough that ABC News came back and said, wait a minute, Mr. President, Fast and Furious began in October of 2009 when George Bush was in Crawford, Texas, cutting firewood on his ranch. You were president, and you didn't end it right away. You only ended it when some agents blew the whistle on what you were doing. So this was your mistake, not somebody else's mistake. This was your program, not someone else's, and you can't get away with blaming everything you do wrong on your predecessor.
Mm-hmm. And, there was no mention of guns in the debate, despite what Bloomberg and the Brady campaign tried to do and convince Jim Laird to do it. But I thought it was interesting because there was one point in the debate where Romney made reference. He pointed right to the Constitution written on the wall behind them. And
right.
Talked about how that's part of who I am. That's my foundation for my principles. You think that made an impact on the gun owners and supporters?
I think it did. I think certainly with our people it did.
Yeah.
Because really I think that this is an administration that on many fronts and over many issues has committed many sins. But perhaps the worst, in a general sense, is their willingness to flaunt the law and the Constitution. And you see it in little ways and in big ways. And this is an administration that if you don't agree with them, if you don't like the president's position, then your rights are suspect anyway. Mm-hmm. They're now doing it on the First Amendment, for Lord's sake. They view the First Amendment and the Second Amendment in the very same way. These aren't rights. These are privileges granted by government that can be restricted or taken away by government. So now in the area of free speech, maybe you should only be free to say things that the Obama administration agrees with, or that our enemies agree with, or that don't offend anyone. And then the Second Amendment, they think that guns and the possession of firearms is not something that is a right, but something they would grant to their friends, just as they would grant crony capitalism deals to their friends. No, this is perhaps the most institutionally dangerous tendency that we've seen on the part of this administration. Its willingness to flaunt the Constitution, ignore the law, and then govern unilaterally through executive order and through harassment of people they don't like, without any reference to what they should be doing in their proper role within a federal structure.
Yeah, I mean, this is a president, as you said, he has said the Constitution gets in my way. But you spoke to the crowd at CPAC there today. What was your message to them?
My message was that from the standpoint of all Americans, but particularly from the standpoint of those of us who support the Second Amendment, which is virtually a majority of Americans, that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Because if this man is given 4 more years in the White House, he will do frontally what he's been trying to do behind the scenes. Without the fear of having to face an electorate again, Barack Obama will come after the Second Amendment in many ways. There will be, if he's reelected, a small arms treaty signed at the United Nations. He will have the opportunity to appoint 1, 2, 3 justices of the Supreme Court, and Lord knows how many lower court judges. Combined, they can either restrict the Heller and McDonald decisions in such a way that they become meaningless, or they can outright reverse them at the Supreme Court level. If that happens, all of the gains we've made over the last 3 or 4 decades are gone, and America's gun rights are at risk. I've been traveling the country, and you know, it's interesting because I was in Montana yesterday delivering the NRA endorsement to our gubernatorial candidate there and to our congressional candidate. And when you get out into many parts of the country where gun rights and the Second Amendment is part of their concept of freedom, where it's part of their culture, they find it hard to believe that there are people who would take those rights away from them.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have to do is say, yes, there are. They're there. They're in Washington. They're in New York. They're in the United Nations. And if they have their way, those rights which you think are not only sacrosanct and which are sacrosanct, but which you think you'll never lose, could indeed be lost. So what we're trying to do is let gun owners know that this election is as important as any election they've faced in their lifetime. I noticed in an interview, Jim Buckley, my former boss, who was, as you know, the conservative senator from New York, later served as Undersecretary of State and as an appeals court judge in the D.C. Circuit, said he believes that this is the most important election in his lifetime, and pointed out that he's almost 90. And I think he was right. This is an election that we have to win.
Yep, it is. And as you said time and time again, and Wayne has and Chris said, gun owners need to do what they do all the time. That's show up and make a difference in the polls.
That's right. If we do that, we're going to do to Barack Obama what we did as gun owners to Al Gore back in 2000. I almost forgot his name. If we do what we need to do, this guy can spend his waning days in Chicago building his presidential library, and you can do little damage from there.
You mentioned Al Gore. I got to tell you, you know what he said last night about the debates? He said, you know what the problem was?
It was the altitude.
It was the altitude. Well, you know, the next debates are in New York and Florida, so he can't blame it on that.
Yeah, I got news for Al. It wasn't the altitude, it was the attitude.